Hello, and thank you for joining us as we share with you some information that should help you navigate the steps necessary to adopt a local version of the California Building Standards Code, also referred to as Title 24, for your local jurisdiction. Let's jump right in. So here are your presenters.
Greetings, I'm Mia Marvelli, Executive Director of the California Building Standards Commission. I joined the Building Standards Commission in 2012 and was selected as the Executive Director in 2016. My career experience spans 30 years working in architecture with several state agencies. I'm also a licensed California architect. As Executive Director, I oversee the day-to-day operations related to the adoption, approval, and publication of the California Building Standards Code, which is Title 24 of the California Code of Regulations. I'm very pleased to present this local code amendments webinar with Stuart Tom.
Hi, I'm Stuart Tom, and I'm pleased to join Mia again in sharing some information to help jurisdictions in adopting their local versions of the California Building Standards Code. I'm a licensed engineer, a certified building official. I'm the past president of JAS Pacific, a provider of municipal services for local jurisdictions. I currently serve on the Executive Board of Directors for the International Code Council, and I've assisted jurisdictions throughout California adopt their own local building and fire codes for the past 12 years. As an instructor, I've taught numerous classes and workshops related to local code adoption, and I'll be sharing some best practices observed by a number of California jurisdictions as they adopt their own local building standards code every 3 years. The International Code Council develops model codes used throughout the world. These model codes often establish the foundation for statewide and regional codes that protect our communities. The California Building Standards Commission establishes the California Building Standards Code, which incorporates necessary adjustments to the model codes in order to properly protect the state of California. Local jurisdictions adopt local amendments as needed to protect their own communities.
This webinar addresses the local code adoption process in California. With the new codes being adopted and published for California, local jurisdictions have an opportunity to complete local adoption ordinances and file them with the California Building Standards Commission or the appropriate state agency. Upon completion of this webinar, participants will better be able to identify the California codes in Title 24, understand the local code adoption process and legal authorities relating to the process, be familiar with the California code adoption process timeline, including the local adoption time frame, identify common mistakes frequently made with local code adoption filings.
So, is it really time to adopt another code? Haven't things settled down since we've been using the I-codes for a while now? Is California proposing many changes to the model codes? Just how much of my current locally adopted code will be reusable? I think I know what I'm doing, but have I been doing it right?
This webinar will address the codes local jurisdictions will be adopting or amending. These codes are published in the California Building Standards Code, Title 24 of the California Code of Regulations, and include the California version of the Building Code, Residential Code, Mechanical Code, Plumbing Code, Fire Code, and so on. While many of these codes are based on nationally developed model codes published by the International Code Council, the International Association of Plumbing and Mechanical Officials, or the National Fire Protection Association, the local amendments must be to the California codes. Local jurisdictions are free to engage in any local process they feel appropriate in order to draft local code language that will ultimately contain their locally amended code. Some local jurisdictions engage with public outreach. Some local jurisdictions hold public meetings and discuss proposed code changes, and some jurisdictions choose not to amend the California Building Standards Code at all. State law authorizes jurisdictions to amend the published Title 24 as necessary for their local conditions and safety needs. The local code adoption process and legal authorities are found in California state law, Health and Safety Code. There are subcategories of Health and Safety Code, including Building Standards Law, State Housing Law, and Fire Protection District Law. The authority in law allows local jurisdictions to make modifications to Title 24 to keep your communities safe.
In a moment, we'll be presenting you with a timeline that shows what the Building Standards Commission has already done to publish the Building Standards Code, and we'll show you how to determine when you will need to take certain steps to ensure that your jurisdiction's governing body approves an ordinance to adopt and amend their local code provisions on time. We'll explain the steps your jurisdiction must take in order to stay on the timeline so that your local codes will be ready to take effect starting January 1st, 2023. And later on in this program, we'll be presenting examples of actual adoption ordinance language, and we'll even suggest several best practices and common errors to avoid.
So what is Title 24? It's the 24th title in the California Code of Regulations, CCR. The CCR is divided into 28 separate titles, each based on subjects or state agency jurisdictions. Regulations are developed by state agencies to implement, clarify, and make specific state law that authorizes them to develop and adopt regulations. Title 24 is reserved specifically for regulations that govern the design and construction of buildings, their associated facilities, and equipment. These regulations apply to all occupancies throughout the state of California. Title 24 is also known as the California Building Standards Code, which is comprised of 13 parts shown here. As the name implies, Part 1 includes administrative regulations for several state agencies, including the Building Standards Commission. In Part 1, the BSC administrative regulations explain and lay out the Title 24 rulemaking process, the appeals and petition processes. Part 1 also includes administrative regulations for the Division of the State Architect and their authority for essential service buildings, state buildings, public schools, and includes their plan check fee, certification of construction. Similarly, the Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development, now called the Department of Healthcare Access and Information, has administrative regulations that lay out their procedures for seismic evaluation of hospitals. Note that on this slide, Part 7 is not listed. This part is currently vacant. When purchasing the code, it's important to know that Part 2 is so large, it's published in 2 volumes. Parts 10 and 8 and 12 are published together in one binder. Later in this video, the use of nationally developed codes and standards will be discussed. Once Title 24 becomes effective as the statewide Building Standards Code, it becomes the law of the land, and local jurisdictions must enforce it as published, or as they are authorized by state law to amend Title 24. This is made clear in Health and Safety Code sections 17958 and 18938, and in the California Building Code, Chapter 1, Division 1, Section 1.1.3. There is a window of time during which the majority of local governments adopt and/or amend the published Title 24. This is between the publication date of July 1, 2022 and the effective date of January 1, 2023. This is the 180-day wait time, allowing design professionals and local governments to become familiar with the new edition of Title 24. A local jurisdiction may make amendments if the amendments are reasonably necessary to protect their communities because of local climatic, geological, topographical conditions, and this may include environmental conditions for Cal Green. These are known as findings. Local amendments may not be less restrictive than the published Title 24 standards. Local jurisdictions can adopt Title 24 unamended. When identifying local amendments, provide the state law authorizing the change, identify the Title 24 section being amended, and the amendment text should be expressly marked and discernible from the text of Title 24. Local amendments are not effective until copies of the amendment documents meeting the requirements have been filed with the California Building Standards Commission or the appropriate state agency. This slide shows some, not all, of the laws that authorize local jurisdictions to amend Title 24. For a full list, we suggest reviewing the Guide for Local Amendments. This guide also contains where ordinances should be filed. We encourage your building department to be familiar with Health and Safety Code sections 18941.5, 17958, 17958.5, 17958.7, and 13869. When reviewing filed ordinances, BSC looks that local amendments are expressly marked, meaning the changes are distinguished from the text of Title 24. One or more of the findings must be provided for the expressly marked change. Often local jurisdictions provide a table applying the findings to the identified local amendment. CBSC is not authorized by law to evaluate the merits of the express findings justifying the local government's climatic, geological, or topographical conditions, or the environmental for Cal Green conditions that necessitate the local amendments. When a local jurisdiction wants to adopt an appendix that is not adopted by a state agency, findings are required. If a local jurisdiction is amending an appendix adopted by a state agency, findings are required and the changes must be expressly marked. When submitting the ordinance to BSC or the other appropriate state agency, it's important to include the information that validates the document was a result of a lawful action by a local governing body, such as an ID number, signature, certification of a clerk, or a transmittal letter. In addition to the laws cited on a previous slide, there are several other laws that authorize local jurisdictions to amend Title 24. The Local Amendments Guide has a full list and contains the filing requirements and state agency contact information. Some of these laws require the local ordinance be filed with a state agency other than BSC. An example is Government Code 8698.4 pertaining to emergency homeless shelters and housing. This law states that the Department of Housing and Community Development shall review and approve a local jurisdiction's draft ordinance to ensure it addresses minimum health and safety standards. A more recent law to emergency housing shelters is Government Code 8698.1 that allows a city with a population of more than 3.5 million or more to permit the operation of an emergency housing facility year-round when the facility does not comply with state building standards for local fire and fire safety standards, if they submit a reasonable standard to the state fire marshal. Each triennial code cycle, the Building Standards Commission updates its Guide for Local Amendment of Building Standards. In it, you'll find all the local amendment law citations and for which state agency specific amendments should be filed. The California Building Standards Codes contain all sorts of rules and regulations that establish how buildings and structures are supposed to be designed, constructed, and used and occupied. Not everything printed in the code books are regulatory or automatically enforceable. I'd like to touch on administrative standards versus building standards. It's very important to distinguish between administrative standards and building standards, not to be confused with the administrative chapter versus the other chapters in the building standards codes. A building standard is defined in Health and Safety Code section 18909. In short, the definition includes a regulation or rule relating to the implementation or enforcement of a building standard not otherwise governed by statute. For example, the minimum strength of concrete used in a foundation or type of pipe used in a building's plumbing system are examples of building standards. Administrative standards are not building standards and therefore are not required to be justified on the basis of a local geological, topographical, or climatic condition. Permit fees, plan check fees, and the administrative process by which a city or county operate are examples of administrative standards. The number of sets of plans which must be submitted in order to initiate plan check is another example of an administrative standard. If an administrative standard is amended by a local jurisdiction that requires the implementation or enforcement of a building standard, it may be necessary for the local jurisdiction to provide a finding for the amendment. The matrix adoption tables, which precede each chapter, are a tool for code users and non-regulatory. These matrix tables identify if state agencies have adopted the entire chapter or the entire chapter with amendments or just specific sections within the chapter. In some instances, an obelisk will identify that a section is not adopted by a state agency. Note that many of the appendix chapters in the back of the various parts of Title 24 are not adopted by California or a state agency, but are available for local adoption. This can be seen in the matrix tables in the text provided below the appendix chapter. It may be necessary for a local jurisdiction to justify adoption of the appendix on the basis of a local geological, topographical, or climatic condition. We'll touch on this a bit more later. Most jurisdictions review the new edition of Title 24 soon after it's published, so they can plan accordingly for their local ordinance adoption process. Usually they time their ordinance to be effective the same day that Title 24 will be effective, which this code cycle is January 1 of 2023. In some cases, a local jurisdiction may not be able to file their ordinance with BSC or the other appropriate state agency, and they must enforce Title 24 as printed until their ordinance is filed. This actually occurs fairly frequently due to delays, which the local jurisdiction may encounter during their local ordinance process. Local amendments may not be effective or enforced before the effective date of Title 24. And if a local jurisdiction chooses to take no action and not file an ordinance with the California Building Standards Commission or other state agencies, they must enforce Title 24 as published.
So, when does your city council or other governing body meet? This is an important consideration because it's usually necessary to have 2 public readings of a proposed ordinance before it becomes a local law. And most jurisdictions attempt to be open and transparent when adopting ordinances that may have an impact on those who are affected. So jurisdictions often conduct broad outreach in order to solicit public comments.
Before we get into the actual process of code adoption by local jurisdictions, let's take a quick look at the California Building Standards Code Title 24 rulemaking process. This undertaking is a huge effort by multiple state agencies, the public, and publishers. Over 14 state agencies are involved in the process. There are over 50 Code Advisory Committee members, which are volunteers, and they are selected by the Commission to review the technical merit of each code change. There are many interested parties that are dedicated to providing input in the process. The process begins with the most recent editions of nationally developed model codes and standards. These model codes are the result of design professionals and code enforcement authorities that have a vested interest in having safe building codes that can be adopted by cities, states, or even other countries. California is mandated to utilize nationally developed codes and standards whenever possible. And building standards law specifies which model codes and publishers are to be used. So many of the Title 24 parts incorporate the model code language, and state agencies are authorized to make amendments. Parts 2, 2.5, 9, and 10 utilize the International Code Council's model codes. Part 3 incorporates the National Fire Protection Association's National Electrical Code, which is NFPA 70. And Parts 4 and 5 incorporate the International Association of Plumbing and Mechanical Officials, Uniform Mechanical and Plumbing Codes, respectively. Once the new model codes are published, the state agencies compare them to the prior edition of Title 24, and then they prepare any necessary amendments. The remaining parts, Parts 1, 6, 8, 11, and 12, are all developed by California state agencies, and sometimes they're called California-only codes. The rulemaking phases listed here are the same as on the previous timeline slide. These phases are required by law and regulation to be performed to ensure building standards are developed in a transparent and public process. If a state agency is developing complex building standards, it may be necessary for them to conduct workshops to involve the many stakeholders affected by the proposed building standards. Once the regulations are drafted, they are submitted to the Building Standards Commission staff as an initial submittal. This cycle, the state agency submitted 45 separate initial rulemaking packages to the BSC office. The BSC staff review them for completeness, compliance with Building Standards Law, and the Administrative Procedure Act. Then they prepare the documents for the Building Standards rulemaking process. This process includes 6 Code Advisory Committee review processes made up of approximately 9 members each. The members review the amendments for technical feasibility, and at a public meeting, they provide recommendations to the state agency, and that information is forwarded on to the Commission later in the process. The state agencies have an opportunity to modify the code changes based on the Code Advisory Committee's recommendations. Then they resubmit the rulemaking package to the Building Standards staff, and that begins the formal public comment period, which must be no less than 45 days. Additional comment periods may be needed to be conducted if a state agency chooses to make additional changes based on comments. Once the public comment period concludes, the final rulemaking documents are submitted to the Building Standards Commission staff, at which time the staff prepares them for a commission review and approval. During this last code cycle, the Commission deliberated and took action to approve and adopt the rulemaking packages at its December 2021 meeting and January 2022 public meetings. The approved and adopted rulemakings are then assembled for the publishers to begin codification of the parts. The common documents that make up a rulemaking package are the express terms, which shows the actual code changes in strikeout and underlined format, the initial statement of reason, which explains why the regulatory changes are necessary, how they benefit the regulated community, and what type of impact the regulations may have on housing, industry, schools, and businesses in California. The Notice of Proposed Action is filed with the Office of Administrative Law, and it announces the public comment period, and it also summarizes the impact to the regulated community. The 9-point criteria substantiates that the provisions of Health and Safety Code 18930 were met. And the Form 399 is a Department of Finance required document. It contains the economic and fiscal impact information that imposes the rulemaking. All along the way, the various rulemaking phases, the documents may be revised and are available on the California Building Standards Commission website. CBSC offers a guide on our website, which goes into great detail about the BSC rulemaking process and the required documents. So you can see that the process to develop the California codes is lengthy and involves many participants, including the public. The BSC staff and commissioners would like to extend our appreciation to the many state agencies that contribute to the development of the regulations, the many Code Advisory Committee members that volunteer their time to review the various code changes, and the many public members that provided comment during the public process. And then finally, we'd like to thank the publishers. The timeline graphic may seem like a sufficient amount of time, but there are very often tight turnaround times and very hard deadlines.
Now that Mia has explained California's rulemaking process, we have a better understanding of how the state agencies, in combination with public comments, have taken the model codes and created the California Building Standards Code. Now we'll take a close look at the local code adoption timeline to see when local jurisdictions need to take certain actions in order to ensure that their own locally adopted codes are ready for enforcement starting on January 1st, 2023. Let's break down this timeline into key phases of local code adoption. Before we get to the portion of the timeline that affects local code officials, we'll start with what I refer to as the handoff from Mia's staff. This portion of the timeline represents the state's rulemaking process that created Title 24. After the Building Standards Commission completes its work, the adopted Building Standards Code is sent to the California Secretary of State. This year, submission to the Secretary of State was scheduled to occur in mid-January 2022. The final version of Title 24, which was sent to the California Secretary of State, is then sent to the publisher. Every effort is made to ensure that the codes are ready for release and available to the public by July 1st, 2022. Regardless of when you are viewing this webinar, we'll be using July 1st as a reference date to calculate how much time is available for local code officials to complete the next steps in the code adoption process. If you are viewing this webinar before or after July 1st, you can easily adjust the timeframes to determine exactly how much time you may have to complete your work. At this point, the 180-day local adoption period commences, which will take us all the way to January 1st, 2023, which is the effective date for the 2022 California Building Standards Code. This is the period of time when local jurisdictions make necessary adjustments to Title 24 that they determine are necessary to adequately protect their communities. If a jurisdiction takes no local adoption action during this period, the unamended Title 24 standards will legally take effect throughout that jurisdiction starting on January 1st, 2023. Most local jurisdictions take advantage of this opportunity to adopt local amendments to Title 24 standards. This is also the period during which local jurisdictions need to provide justifications for those amendments and ultimately file everything with the Building Standards Commission. A jurisdiction may amend Title 24 on the basis of a local geologic, topographic, climatic, or green building condition. Keep in mind that local amendments may not reduce the level of protection that has already been established in Title 24. Local amendments must be equal to or more protective than Title 24. Also, if any local amendments have an effect on energy conservation, the jurisdiction needs to secure certification from the California Energy Commission before such amendments may be enforced. The final result of this process is the new code that will take local effect after January 1st, 2023 for that particular jurisdiction. There are some important dates to keep in sight. These are actually the most important dates to local code officials because they need to stay ahead of these dates if they want to avoid a delay in the enforcement of their new locally amended codes. Each local jurisdiction may have slightly different deadlines, but it's easy to determine what they are by working backwards from January 1st, 2023. The first critical date to consider is the last City Council meeting occurring at least 30 days prior to January 1st, 2023. This is important to avoid the need for an urgency clause in the ordinance. In this example, imagine that your City Council meets every Tuesday. November 29th, 2022 is the last Tuesday of the year that occurs at least 30 days prior to January 1st, 2023. By setting a target of City Council approval at least 30 days prior to January 1st, 2023, a jurisdiction will stay on schedule for implementation of the new code starting on January 1st without the need of an urgency clause in their ordinance. To determine the second critical date, code officials need to determine when their local code adoption ordinance will be publicly introduced during a prior City Council meeting. This is generally referred to as a first reading or introduction of the proposed ordinance, and it generally occurs during the regularly scheduled City Council meeting immediately before the scheduled adoption. For our discussion, that would normally occur the Tuesday before November 29th. But many jurisdictions cancel City Council meetings and other municipal activities during the week of Thanksgiving. This practice of going dark can result in an unexpected delay, so most jurisdictions intentionally select a City Council meeting date that occurs prior to Thanksgiving week. In this case, that day would be Tuesday, November 15th. This marks the last date that a jurisdiction can comfortably introduce their code adoption ordinance and still remain on schedule. As we previously discussed, many jurisdictions promote an open process which encourages public input and interaction. This type of outreach and public input is often conducted through public meetings or by a building department's own appeals board or commission. To determine the third critical date, imagine that the jurisdiction has a building department appeals board that meets on the third Wednesday of each month. If that jurisdiction wishes to hold 2 public outreach meetings with its appeal board, the last opportunity to complete any public outreach and secure a recommendation to the City Council would be Wednesday, October 19th. If all goes well, the Appeals Board can conclude discussion and consideration of proposed local code amendments on this date and submit a recommendation to the City Council for adoption of the local amendments. And the final critical date represents the opportunity for the code official to introduce the local code amendments to the public for the very first time. Working backwards on the timeline again, we find that September 21st is the third Wednesday during the prior month when the Appeals Board is scheduled to meet. This represents the latest opportunity on which the code official can utilize the appeals board to conduct the first of 2 public outreach meetings. If any public comments are received during this meeting, they can be considered and addressed prior to the second public outreach meeting that will take place on October 19th. By working backwards from January 1st, 2023, local code officials can determine their own opportunities to complete public outreach hearings and secure City Council approval in order to meet the January 1st effective date.
So let's start by taking a look at how much time local jurisdictions have if they do not intend to adopt a local code ordinance. Between July 1st, when the codes are first published, until January 1st of 2023, when the code becomes effective, there are exactly 184 calendar days. This is how much time local jurisdictions have to get ready to begin enforcement of Title 24 if they intend to not create local amendments and intend to apply the code exactly as published by the Building Standards Commission. But remember, between July 1st and January 1st, there are a lot of weekends and holidays that you won't be working. This leaves only 125 working days for local jurisdictions to prepare for enforcement of California's next edition of Title 24.
Regardless of the time between the July 1st publication date until the January 1st effective date of Title 24, jurisdictions that intend to adopt local amendments must make arrangements for 2 readings by their city council or other governing body. Using a model city for which the city council meets every Tuesday, we just learned that November 15th is the last normally scheduled city council meeting that an initial reading of an ordinance can be safely scheduled. This means that a local code adoption ordinance must be completed and placed on the City Council agenda for November 15th, 2022, which is only 138 days after Title 24's publication date on July 1st. This may seem like a lot of time, but if you subtract weekends and holidays, this actually leaves only 95 working days. And if your jurisdiction makes an effort to be open and transparent when passing new laws, you may be expected to conduct 1 or more public hearings for outreach and stakeholder input. For a city that has a Building and Safety Appeals Board that meets the 3rd Wednesday of each month, September 21st would be the last date to utilize such board or commission to hold the first of 2 public outreach meetings to present a draft ordinance to the community. There are only 83 days between July 1st and September 21st when this jurisdiction would need to present its draft ordinance for public outreach. And if we subtract weekends and holidays, we see that the jurisdiction would have only 57 working days between Title 24's publication date of July 1st until it needs to begin its public outreach to inform the community of proposed local amendments to the code. So, what do local amendments look like anyway? Well, amendments should look just like Title 24. Use the same format and similar language to what is found in Title 24. It's best to use the same section numbering as found in Title 24, and local amendments should be placed in a logical and appropriate location within the text of Title 24 to avoid confusion or conflicting interpretations. Some jurisdictions may have a need to renumber all of the code sections in order to coordinate their building standards within their municipal code, and that's okay. But if there is no overriding reason to adjust the section numbering, it's generally best to keep it consistent with Title 24. So if local amendments need to be justified, what do those justifications look like? It's best to utilize clear, simple language that explains why the jurisdiction has chosen to amend a portion of Title 24. The justifications to amend building standards must be based on a local geological, topographical, or climatic condition.
A justification may not merely state that an amendment is necessary due to a local geological condition. The justification must expressly identify what that local condition is. Somewhere in the ordinance, the authority having jurisdiction must provide justification for the findings. Each amendment must have a finding. It is not acceptable to justify an entire ordinance or a large number of amendments with a single statement. Health and Safety Code 17958.7 requires a copy of those findings together with the modification or change expressly marked and identified to which each finding refers shall be filed with the California Building Standards Commission. It is okay to use any particular finding repeatedly. Findings do not need to be a local condition that is unique to a jurisdiction. A local geological condition that affects one particular jurisdiction is likely to affect neighboring jurisdictions as well. Therefore, such a condition is not unique to a particular jurisdiction and may still be valid. An example, a local jurisdiction may justify a local amendment requiring stricter seismic design standards than those which exist in Title 24 if it is significantly affected by a nearby active earthquake fault. This could be justified geologically by utilizing a nexus between the nearby earthquake fault and the need to provide increased lateral strength to buildings, even if the very same finding is also used by a neighboring jurisdiction to address its own local amendment. There are many state agencies that have a need to contribute to Title 24. In fact, the differences between the model codes published by ICC, IAPMO, and NFPA versus Title 24 come from a variety of rulemaking packages that were promulgated by approximately 14 state agencies. State agencies are authorized in law to promulgate regulations in Title 24. While the Building Standards Commission is authorized to adopt Title 24 on behalf of the state, the BSC banner amendments only apply to specific occupancies, and these are state buildings, UC, and CSUs. If a local jurisdiction wished to adopt those amendments, they must cite them in their ordinance. The BSC CG banner is for green building standards for all non-residential occupancies, and unless a local jurisdiction is adopting a green tier, no ordinance is necessary for those amendments because the green building standards apply to all non-residential occupancies. Another example is the SFM banner. The state housing law within the Health and Safety Code assigns the responsibility for developing fire and panic safety building standards to the Office of the State Fire Marshal. For more information, see Health and Safety Code section 17921, little b. Such adoptions are shown by the acronym SFM, sometimes shown in the code text and in the matrix adoption tables. You can read more about the authority, reference, and application of the banners in Chapter 1, Division 1 of the California Building Code. The state agencies that are most likely to modify the national model codes that establish the California codes are the Department of Housing and Community Development, the Office of the State Fire Marshal, the Division of the State Architect, and the Office of Statewide Health and Planning, known as OSHPD, and their new name is the Department of Healthcare Access and Information, but the acronym is not changed in the 2022 edition of Title 24. These agencies are further broken down to subcategories, and the California state amendments that are preceded by the following agency banners are the ones that most building officials are responsible for enforcing: BSCCG, HCD-1, HCD-2, SFM, DSA.AC, and OSHPD 3.
So let's talk about what it takes to assemble an actual local code adoption ordinance and the key elements that should be included. First of all, there is no mandatory format. Different jurisdictions do things as they feel appropriate. And since there's no mandatory format, any of the 13 disparate parts of Title 24 may be amended and adopted by an individual ordinance, or they may all be amended and adopted at the same time in a single ordinance. Frequently, questions come up regarding regional uniformity of local codes. Is it important that neighboring jurisdictions adopt similar codes? What if your jurisdiction wants to adopt stronger, safer, more sustainable standards than your neighboring jurisdictions? What should you do? Decisions regarding what to amend in your local code should be based on your community's needs. There's a lot to consider. Safety is important. Efficiency is important. The cost of compliance is important. Every potential amendment to Title 24 may have specific benefits as well as consequences. When considering local amendments to Title 24, strive to find the right balance for your community. Every local code adoption represents an opportunity to improve your local codes in a manner that provides the best balance between enhanced building standards and the associated cost to comply with those enhanced standards. No jurisdiction's local code is perfect. Some jurisdictions carry over antiquated standards that serve no real purpose. The local code adoption process is the perfect opportunity to do some house cleaning. Other jurisdictions have real bona fide conditions that need to be addressed. Think about aspects of your local building standards code that may warrant some attention. Now is the time.
Local ordinances must be adopted by the jurisdiction's governing body, such as its city council. Using a policy is not sufficient. Contract cities need to adopt their own code, even if by reference. Otherwise, the unamended Title 24 applies to that jurisdiction. The local building standard amendments must be expressly marked or identified, and every locally amended building standard requires a finding such as a local climatic, geological, or topographical condition. Local ordinances must contain a justification for the findings, and local ordinances must be filed each code cycle, even if the local jurisdiction is just carrying forward prior amendments. AB 210 of 2009 authorized the green building standards are allowed to be amended. Appendices are not part of Title 24 unless they are adopted by a state agency or a local jurisdiction has adopted them via an ordinance. The next few slides provide several examples. On this slide, Appendix G, please note that under the title, it says not adopted by a state agency. And in the note, it says, the provisions contained in this appendix are not mandatory unless specifically adopted by a state agency or referenced in the adopting ordinance. And if you note, no state agency has amended or adopted this appendix based on the matrix adoption table. For Appendix I, patio covers, you can see that the State Fire Marshal has adopted specific sections and that HCD has adopted the entire chapter. And again, the note below patio cover says the provisions contained in this appendix are not mandatory unless specifically adopted by a state agency or referenced in an adopting ordinance. Since patio covers is adopted by HCD, it is applicable for those occupancies. And finally, there are now cases in Title 24, like this example for Appendix P, where statute identifies the enactment to be voluntary based on the determinations and declarations made. Even though HCD adopted this appendix, the provisions must be contained in the local adoption ordinance. The good news is the 2022 edition of Title 24 doesn't have a lot of new information to become familiar with. The reason is during the 2019 intervening code cycle, which resulted in the Blue Supplement, several state agencies early adopted the 2021 International Building Code Heavy Timber Regulations. The State Fire Marshal also early adopted Energy Storage System Regulations and Special Amusement Area Regulations. If you are familiar with the 2019 supplement that became effective July 1 of 2022, then there are not too many more changes. A few to note are the BSC included language in the permit expiration section of Chapter 1 in all parts of Title 24 to reflect AB 2913 statutes of 2018, which are the permit expiration change from 180 days to 12 months. The State Fire Marshal updated daycare regulations pursuant to SB 234 statutes of 2019. And HCD included fall prevention regulations pursuant to SB 280 statutes of 2019. In July, BSC is issuing a 2022 Title 24 code change document with detailed information.
Here are a couple of important items that are sometimes overlooked. First, repeal of prior ordinance. This is often overlooked by municipalities and is critically important to ensure that obsolete provisions are expressly repealed. References to prior code. Think about including a provision that expressly indicates that prior references to the former local code shall be construed to apply to the corresponding provisions of the new proposed local code. Most jurisdictions provide the public with free details and handouts ranging from patio covers, carports, fences, small retaining walls, and much more. Since many of those handouts contain references to a prior version of the code, addressing this can avoid conflicts. So, how are local code amendments justified? What needs to be done to ensure that local amendments to Title 24 are acceptable? What are the key elements of a local jurisdiction's justification to amend the code? When is a jurisdiction required to justify their amendments? Is there a particular format that must be followed? Can all amendments be justified at the same time?
Non-building standards such as administrative standards do not require a finding, do not need to be expressly marked or filed with the Building Standards Commission. Health and Safety Code requires findings for amendments to building standards and that the amendments be expressly marked. There is no mandated format for a local ordinance as long as the amendments are expressly marked and have a finding made by the governing body. Jurisdictions submit ordinances in a variety of ways, and a city resolution is a formal action taken by the governing body which is frequently used.
The California Health and Safety Code requires that the governing body of a city or county, before making any modifications or changes to Title 24, shall make an express finding that such modifications or changes are reasonably necessary because of local climatic, geological, or topographical conditions. It also requires that such a finding shall be available as a public record, and a copy of those findings, together with the modifications or change expressly marked and identified to which each finding refers. This means that each and every local amendment to Title 24 needs to be individually and expressly justified on the basis of a local climatic, geologic, or topographic condition. Furthermore, once the amendments to Title 24 are adopted, along with their respective justifications, a copy needs to be made available as a public record by filing with the Building Standards Commission. Failure to take this step renders the local jurisdiction's actions incomplete, and only the unamended Title 24 building standards are considered to be in effect until the amendments and proper justifications have been filed with the Building Standards Commission. Therefore, it is important to file with the Building Standards Commission prior to January 1st, 2023.
So after the governing body has adopted a local amendment ordinance and has properly justified the local amendments, they are generally filed with the Building Standards Commission. However, there are a number of exceptions. For example, ADU ordinances and emergency housing ordinances are filed with the Department of Housing and Community Development. Fire protection ordinances are filed with the Department of Housing and Community Development as well. For a full list of where to file your local amendments based on the type of amendments, look at our guide for local amendments on our website. It includes the necessary information and how to file the ordinance and where to file the ordinance. It's best to send the ordinance if you're mailing a hard copy by certified mail. Our preference is that you file electronically to our ordinance email address listed here. We prefer that you submit a machine-readable, accessible PDF in compliance with AB 434 statutes of 2017. This allows us to post your accepted ordinance online. CBSC will acknowledge receipt of your ordinance. We do not evaluate the justifications or the amendments, and CBSC will post accepted ordinances on its website listed here.
So let's take a look at some excerpts from actual documents to see what we've been talking about. We'll take a look at a City Council resolution used to justify local amendments, portions of an actual code adoption ordinance, and documents used to secure certification from the California Energy Commission. Let's start with the City Council resolution. In this example, we can see how some cities use a council resolution to expressly and individually justify each local amendment on the basis of a local climatic, geologic, or topographic condition. In this case, we can see that resolution number 16-196 was adopted. In section 1 of the resolution, we can see that the modifications are required in order to provide specific and greater protections to the public health, safety, and welfare than are afforded by the California Building Standards Code. As we move further in section 1 of the resolution, we find a very important reference to an attached Exhibit 1. As we will soon see, this Exhibit 1 contains the key elements which justify each of the local amendments. And as we can see in Section 3 of the resolution, the City Clerk was directed to transmit a certified copy of the resolution to the Building Standards Commission. Here's an excerpt of the resolution, which shows how each individual amendment was expressly described and justified. For example, if we look at amendment number 50 related to roof sheathing, we can see that justifications B and D in an attached matrix have been expressly applied. Use of a matrix or table is a convenient method of applying justifications to a large number of local amendments. If we look to the end of the resolution, we can find the matrix, and if we scroll down to the amendment related to roof sheathing, we see a reference to justifications B and D. So what are justifications B and D? Let's take a look at the last page of the resolution. On the last page of the resolution, we find a key that clearly describes 4 different justifications labeled A, B, C, and D. For clarity, let's examine justification B, which states, "This amendment is justified on the basis of a local geologic condition. The city is subject to earthquake hazards caused by its location on the Sierra Madre Fault near the base of the San Gabriel Mountains. Said fault is the eastward extension of the same fault upon which the 1971 San Fernando earthquake originated. Other faults which potentially could cause seismic activity in the city include the Verdugo Fault located near the southwest edge of the Verdugo Mountains and its branches to the east. The justification concludes, the modifications and changes cited herein are designed to better limit property damage as a result of seismic activity. So now let's take a look at the ordinance. First note that this ordinance was used to amend multiple aspects of Title 24, including the CBC, CRC, CEBC, CPC, CMC, CEC, CFC, and much more. Second, note that the code which is being adopted and amended is the California Building Code and not the International Building Code. This is an important distinction, and some jurisdictions incorrectly reference the International Building Code as their starting point, which is incorrect. If we move on to page 6 of the ordinance, we can find language to address references to prior codes. Many jurisdictions include this type of language to resolve potential conflicts that might otherwise result when references to prior codes remain on standard details, forms, and handouts that continue to be circulated at their public counter and online. At the bottom of this page, we see that some jurisdictions clearly define the penalty associated with violations of the code. While it may not be necessary to remind people that violations of municipal ordinances are generally categorized as misdemeanors, inclusion of this language can sometimes help with code enforcement activities. And on page 7 of the ordinance, we see a clear declaration of the effective date of the amended code. Note that the jurisdiction included language to clearly indicate that projects for which plans and permit applications were filed prior to the effective date would be subject to the previous code. Here we see that the jurisdiction includes a provision to ascribe responsibility of compliance with the adopted building standards to the permittee. This is a useful provision because it clearly indicates that no city approval shall relieve or exonerate any person from the responsibility of complying with the provisions of the code, and it also affirms that no vested rights accrue for work performed in violation of the code. Many jurisdictions have found that inclusion of this type of language may be helpful in establishing the permittee's ultimate responsibility. And here we see some typical examples of locally amended code language. Note that the format and section numbering remain consistent with that found in Title 24. Here we can see some examples of how appendices can be adopted. In Section 104, note that Appendix F was adopted without any further local modification, while in Section 105, we can see that the jurisdiction adopted Appendix I related to patio covers and even amended the appendix within the ordinance. Finally, let's take a moment to discuss certification by the California Energy Commission. As we stated earlier, any local amendment to the California Building Standards Code which has a potential impact on energy efficiency must receive certification by the California Energy Commission. This cover letter identifies the documents that were submitted, and we'll take a look at the key components. The most important component was an energy cost effectiveness study. In this example, the jurisdiction enlisted the assistance of a reputable consultant to independently determine whether the mandatory inclusion of radiant roof barriers was a cost-effective building construction standard within that jurisdiction's climate zone. As we can see on the last page of the report, the consultant considered several model prototype buildings and concluded that the local amendments to require radiant roof barriers had an average payback period in the 11 to 12-year range. Assuming that the useful life of roof sheathing is 30 years, the analysis concluded that radiant barriers are cost-effective as a mandatory requirement for roofing above attic spaces in the jurisdiction's Climate Zone 9. And finally, here's a copy of the certification that was issued by the California Energy Commission.
The Building Standards Commission provides guidebooks online to assist local jurisdictions and those affected by the implementation and enforcement of building standards. The Guide for Local Amendments of Building Standards has useful information for local jurisdictions such as local government responsibilities, local amendment requirements, applicable state laws, causes for rejection of an ordinance, which state agency the ordinance should be filed. This guide and its companion video are especially helpful for code officials that have never adopted a local code before and will be doing so for the first time this code cycle. Other useful guidebooks for local jurisdictions are It's Your Building Department and a guide for filing permit fees. These can be found on BSC's website under the Resources tab by going to dgs.ca.gov/BSC. Also on our resources website are short videos designed to provide a high-level overview of information that's provided in some of the other guidebooks we offer. This is also found on our resources page, and these videos include about the rulemaking process, about Title 24, and about Cal Green, and there are several others.
Don't forget that ICC has numerous other model codes that are available as resources for local jurisdictions that are interested in amending their codes to suit their local needs. Here are some examples of some of those codes that several California jurisdictions will be including in their local code adoption ordinances. The International Property Maintenance Code, the International Swimming Pool and Spa Code, and the International Wildland Urban Interface Code.
Any administrative non-building standards contained in these model codes can be adopted directly into a local jurisdiction's own code without a need to justify on the basis of local geological, topographical, or climatic condition. If any of these resources contain more protective building standards than Title 24, and if those standards would be beneficial to a local jurisdiction, they can be included as long as there is a local condition that can be used to justify the amendment. The California Health and Safety Code sets forth the legal mechanism by which local jurisdictions can consider their own special needs and tailor the codes in a manner that will provide the best reasonable protection for its community. Please keep in mind that state law or existing regulations prevail. Adopting a model code or a reference standard other than what was adopted by the California Building Standards Commission would be to enhance a law or a regulation if allowed. An example is the Wildland Urban Interface Regulations. The State Fire Marshal is authorized to promulgate these regulations, which are found in the California Building Code, the California Fire Code, and the California Residential Code. The defensible space requirements are found in law and also reflected in the California Fire Code Chapter 49. The Building Standards Commission is required to reprint the Swimming Pool Safety Act, and this is done so in the California Building Code Chapter 31 and also in an appendix of the California Residential Code. The California Building Code and the California Residential Code language directly reflects the Swimming Pool Safety Act, which is found in Health and Safety Code 115920 through 115959. The Swimming Pool Safety Act is frequently modified through legislation and not always in alignment with the Title 24 rulemaking cycle effective dates. So it's important that the local jurisdictions verify the Swimming Pool Safety Act's requirements. Thank you for taking time to watch this educational video. Hopefully this information will address most of the questions that many of you have regarding the adoption of local building standards for your own jurisdiction. But if you need assistance, visit the Building Standards Commission website where there's even more information, and we are also happy to answer any questions you may have. On behalf of CalBO, JAS, and the California Building Standards Commission and the International Code Council, we thank you for spending time with us today.